listener production.
Hello, Sacha Barbour Gatt with you. Welcome to The Briefing. The luxury of ordering food to your door is something many of us are lucky enough to be able to indulge in. Is there anything better than having the urge for Thai or sushi or maybe a cheeky burger while sitting on the couch and being able to have it brought to you without so much as standing up? There is no doubt the rise of Uber Eats, DoorDash and other food delivery apps have changed our lives. But is the convenience worth people dying over? A 27-year-old DoorDash delivery cyclist died in a hit and run in Melbourne on Tuesday night. The driver, a 32-year-old man, has since been charged with failing to stop and render assistance at an accident and drink driving. The Transport Workers Union says it's the 18th death of a delivery rider on Australian roads since the explosion in home delivery services. So, are we as consumers part of the problem? And are the delivery companies hustling their staff, forcing them to take unnecessary risks when getting our orders out to us? Michael Kaine is the National Secretary of the Transport Workers Union and he joins me now to talk about it. Michael, welcome to The Briefing. We've seen this massive increase in the number of food deliveries happening every day across Australia in the last few years. How many drivers and riders are actually needed to keep up with that demand?
There are tens of thousands of them, and everyone will know that these workers became particularly prominent during the pandemic. I mean, they were actually some of the heroes of the pandemic, delivering to us in our family homes, to our businesses while we're in lockdown, actually before there was any thought of a vaccine. And, you know, that post-pandemic period where we all came back into the economy, back into the community, we would have thought there'd been a bit of a downturn, but actually it's just continued this kind of exponential growth. So there are tens of thousands of these workers now in the gig economy, tens of thousands of people who are apt up to do part or all of their working life as food delivery workers. And of course that brings with it a whole series of challenges, not the least of which is how we can better support them so that there's less pressure on them as they perform their work.
And we will get into that, but I'm curious if you could explain to us, paint a picture of what the sort of pressures these workers are under, like how much strain and stress do they face every day?
Well, if you just think about it, you know, there'll be listeners that have actually performed this work. There'll be others that, you know, have experienced this work because they hear that knock on the door. They've ordered through their app and there's their food as if by magic. But in between them clicking payment on the app and that knock on the door, these workers are working really hard. The job gets given out through the gig technology. It's pushed out to a number of riders in a particular area. It's the quickest rider to accept that job that gets the job. So you've got the notion of these workers out there on their bikes actually in competition with each other, hitting the button. Once they hit the button, of course, and sometimes that'll be while they're trying to navigate city traffic, they've got a set period of time that is set by an algorithm that they've got to get to the restaurant, get the food picked up and get it delivered. And of course, that's not even thinking about what the weather conditions are on a particular day. And, you know, if they don't comply with that time frame 2 or 3 times in a row, then they can be kicked off the app. They can be sacked, really, without any recourse, deactivated, they call it, which is terribly dehumanising. And those are the types of pressures that are always at the forefront of these workers' minds as they're doing that job for us to get that magic knock on the door.
Let's talk about what sort of protections are in place for these workers. Now, you know, there's a difference between being an employee of a company and being a subcontractor. So I'm curious to know what they fall under. But also, you know, they're getting things like minimum wage. Are there workplace health and safety requirements that, you know, their bosses or the company that they ride for are responsible for enforcing? Do they get breaks? Like, what do those protections look like for the average delivery rider in Australia?
Well, this is the real problem. Your question really hits on it. And that is there are very few protections for these workers because the gig economy's come into our country in the last 8 years for food delivery workers, maybe the last 12 for rideshare workers. And these companies have engaged these workers outside of the system of protections that we've built up in Australia for decades that employees enjoy. So employees enjoy a minimum wage, the right to be off work paid when they're sick, the right to some holiday time, the right to protection from unfair, unjust dismissals of their work, and the right to a safe working environment. Now, these companies engage these workers as independent contractors, and independent contractors have none of those rights. And so you start from below a zero base. Now, the problem with that is that in a survey we did last year of over 1,000 gig workers, you find that 2/3 of them, that is actually nearly 7 out of 10, are being paid below the minimum wage. And when you're paid below the minimum wage, you've got to work longer or faster to get up somewhere around that minimum. And when you're interfacing with people on the road, that's a deadly recipe. So, they've been placed outside of the system. They have very few rights that are available to them. They don't have a right to a minimum wage, no right to leave, no right to superannuation, no right to start building for their retirement. Very few workplace health and safety provisions apply to them. So, it is a recipe for disaster, and disaster has happened. We keep getting these workers losing their lives as they're doing this critical work for all of us.
What about the laws that came into force this week that guaranteed minimum rights for gig workers? Does that not apply to food delivery drivers, or has it not gone far enough in the union's view?
Well, on the 26th, actually, it's just a tick over this week. So next week, on the 26th of August, we are really hopeful and excited because there is a new suite of protections that come in place under the Fair Work Act. This will be actually a world first. The Albanese government in February passed this legislation with the support of key crossbenchers in the Senate, like independent ACT Senator David Pocock. And for the first time, they empower an industrial tribunal, in our case, the Fair Work Commission, to basically ignore what label a company applies. So in this case, we've just spoken about, they call them independent contractors. Well, Fair Work Commission can basically ignore that and look into the type of work that these workers perform, look into the level of reliance that they have on the company that engages them, and start putting in place enforceable standards that build protection for these workers that are attuned to kind of that level of dependency that they have. So many of these workers, for example, if you're performing this work on a bike, you're not really a small business. You don't really have the power to negotiate your rates. You're not the ones that, are finding the work from the restaurant, for example. The company's doing that for you. And you really are akin to an employee. So we say you should have rights and protections that are akin to an employee set of rights and protections. And that's what we'll be applying for next week. The Transport Workers Union will make an application in the new system next week for food delivery workers. And we're calling on the rest of the industry, of course, to support this application, because the quicker we can get those standards established, the sooner we can start lifting some of the pressures that exist on these workers and make their work even more dangerous.
I want to ask about the role consumers play in this. I mean, I posed the question in the introduction, do we have something to answer for as the people who use food delivery services, but also I guess what we can do to maybe make it a little bit safer for our, food delivery drivers. What role do we play in this?
I think the best role that people can play in this right now is to keep an eye in the next few weeks and the coming months on those companies that are coming out and supporting the Fair Work Commission in its new job to set and establish a safety net of fair and reasonable standards for these workers. Which companies are supporting that approach of the Fair Work Commission and which companies aren't? And then, of course, consumers voting with their feet on that basis would be great. It'd send fantastic messages. So if you've got one food delivery company that is saying publicly, yes, we support this, we support the establishment of these standards, use them, and don't use the other company until they too come out and start supporting that. Because at the end of the day, these companies as well want to make sure that they continue to have the social license to continue to operate. People have become really accustomed to this convenience, but they're also becoming increasingly concerned that when they hear that knock on the door, that the person behind that door is exploited or underpaid or pressured or in mortal danger as they're performing that work. And I don't think any of us want to see that.
Absolutely. Look, I do have to ask the question, Michael, this incident in Melbourne this week was a hit and run incident at no fault of the rider as far as we or the police have been able to ascertain. But, I have witnessed delivery riders driving and performing dangerously on the roads or on footpaths. How much of it is a personal responsibility thing where it's like, okay, well, we all have I drive a car, I have to follow the laws, and if I don't and I get into an accident and I'm at fault, well, there's no one else to blame but me. How much of that comes into this with delivery riders and drivers?
And that's a fair enough question as well. I mean, we all have personal responsibility, especially when we get on the road and we're interfacing with other people. We have an onerous responsibility. When you're on the road as any driver, there's inherent dangers. When you're a transport worker on the road, there are inherent dangers in your job just because of the nature of travelling on our roads. The last thing we need is a continuing situation where not only do these workers have to navigate the inherent dangers of the job, but they're loaded on top of them the pressure to make a living for their family and to go hell for leather because their wages are too low, to go hell for leather because if they don't, they can be kicked off and sacked by an algorithm with no chance to challenge that. Those are the types of pressures that heap additional pressure on that inherent danger. Now, that's not making an excuse and saying that people don't have personal responsibility. Of course they do. But it's much easier to adhere to that personal responsibility when those other pressures are lifted from you. And when they are, then we can have a realistic and justifiable expectation that that personal responsibility is taken as seriously as possible. Until then, of course, we don't know whether people are going hell for leather because they're trying to feed their family or because they're scared that they're going to lose their job with no chance to challenge it. And once we get that balance right, then that question will have even more force.
Just before we let you go, Michael, I'm just curious to know what the federal government is doing. Are they cooperating? Are they doing enough? And what are you pushing for them to do in the future?
Well, the first thing that we're looking at is actioning these new laws. This current federal government went into the previous election from opposition, promising that it would put in place a system of standards building for gig workers. It's done that. Now we're in the process next week of starting to build those standards, and that's a good thing. There's work for other governments around the country to do as well. So our workers' compensation systems, that is the systems that protect us when we're injured or assist our families when the worst happens and as workers we die, don't automatically apply to gig workers either. And so state governments have work to do. The New South Wales government, the Queensland government has indicated that they will act to fix those loopholes, and we'd like to see that action from other states around the country as well.
Michael Kaine there, National Secretary of the Transport Workers Union. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. We would love it if you could share this app with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, we put up heaps on Instagram, search The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube, search Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed tomorrow at 6 a.m. with headlines and another deep dive. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Thanks for listening.
Listener.